From children's stories to Instagram aesthetics, from the Lord of the Rings to pagan religions, it seems that elves and fairies are everywhere in our culture. But where do they come from? Are they real? And most importantly, why are we so fascinated with them? Today, we are gonna delve into this enigma together. But before we start, if you like stories, fairy tales, legends and mythology, do click the subscribe button down below and ring the bell to be notified about every new video. That stain was really bothering me. I've always liked elves and fairies. When I was a child, I would spend all of my school breaks in the library reading The Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings. Being an overall nerd, I never quite stopped. But even I can recognize in the last 1 or 2 years since the start of the pandemic, there's been an explosion of references to elves and fairies in popular culture. I've been wondering, why is that? Perhaps if you're on Instagram or another social media, you've realized there's an aesthetics phenomenon going on. And one of these aesthetics is fairycore, another one is elfcore, another one is goblincore. And you see people from all over the world dressed in pointy ears and fairy wings, ethereal clothing, just hanging out in nature. I do wonder, why did it happen now? What is this telling us about our culture and about ourselves? In order to know that, we need to examine the history and folklore of fairy. Before anything else, let's get to the root of the issue. Where do the words fairy and elf come from? The word elf is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as, in stories, a creature like a small person with pointed ears who has magic powers. Etymologically, it descends from the Old English alf and is related, for example, to the Latin albus, which means white. In pre-Christian times, white was linked to beauty, particularly female-coded beauty, especially in Germanic areas, like Scandinavia and Anglo-Saxon England. The word elf was predominant in England until around the 12th century, where it was replaced by fairy. Fairy is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a supernatural being of diminutive size that uses magic to meddle for good or evil in human affairs. Etymologically, it comes from the Latin fata, or fate. After the Celts were defeated by the Romans, the Latin word for fate became associated with female Celtic goddesses. In the area of former Gaul, Latin became Old French, and the T in the word was omitted, becoming fey. Later, starting from the 12th century, this new word arrived in Britain. As French was considered an elite language, the word fairy was often used in literature. But how did the belief in elves and fairies develop? I was rather curious and decided to, just as you do, read a few books and doctoral theses. For simplicity's sake, we are going to examine 3 folkloric traditions: Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon and Celtic. If you want me to make more in-depth videos about these traditions and fairy lore, do let me know down in the comments. The most important thing to know about elves in the Scandinavian context is that they were conceived as otherworldly beings, so not inhabiting the same world as humans do. The word for elves was alf. Some Old Norse expert, please tell me if I'm pronouncing this correctly. This term only really applied to male elves. There were no female elves as such. It's particularly interesting that in a lot of the literature, when people talk about the gods, they used 2 key phrases, Aesir and Vanir. The Vanir were Frey, Freya and Njord. Another phrase that's used is Aesir and Alf, the gods and elves. This would mean that the elves are just another name for gods such as Freya, who are also possibly worshipped in Swedish paganisms. Problem with sources from Scandinavia, texts are usually already from the Christian era, so they are affected by Christian mythology. In the Eddas, we see light elves and dark elves inhabiting different worlds, but the experts basically say that this is only due to the influence of Christianity, which made writers represent supernatural beings like elves as divided into polar opposite groups. One evil and ugly, and one good and beautiful. So the elves characterize figures that are ambiguous, close to us, but not quite like us. Why are there no female elves? Instead of elf, there are 2 other words that are often used, Disir and Norn. You may be familiar with the Norns, which are 3 supernatural maidens that sit by the root of Yggdrasil, the tree of the world, and weave the fates of men. But there is no real reason to think that there were really only 3 of them. In texts like the Völundrkvida, Wayland's Ballad, elves were the males and the Disir were the maidens. The males have a characteristically female gender role. Volund is described as having a wide neck, which is usually only used to describe human female beauty. And he also adopts a rather passive attitude, which was usually associated with women. The supernatural female beings, they are characterized as being warlike, which was usually associated with human men. Let's go on to the Anglo-Saxon context. The early Old English evidence doesn't show us ethereal or invisible beings in any way, but rather anthropomorphic ones. So similar to humans, neither good nor evil. But later in the Anglo-Saxon period, there starts a process of demonization. In 1598, during the period of the witch hunts, a healer named Androman was executed for confessing to encounters with the Fairy Queen. There is a process of feminization of the word elf, so from gender non-conforming males into dangerous, attractive females who, with the womanly wiles, endanger the male human protagonist. And this seduction was often achieved by inducing altered states of mind, which was linked to the belief that elves had the power of inflicting illnesses. Think, for example, of Morgan Le Fay from Arthurian legend, but sometimes thought, as her name implies, as the Queen of Faery. She is described more and more as an antagonist of Arthur, his court, and all that is good and orderly and Christian. And there is this episode in which she bewitches and seduces a man into attempting to kill the king. All of this tells us that elves are often thought of as society's mirror image. There is a gender reversal in the roles, but also generally a female dominance. The fairy queen appears much more often in text than the fairy king. This is clearly different from what happened in historical human society, where women during the medieval period became more and more subservient to men. So functionally, they serve as both supposed alternative to society, but also through the demonization of this mirrored image as a way to maintain and reinforce societal values. So before the medieval period, the concept of gender wasn't necessarily aligned with biological sex. It was more about a strong, independent and a hard gender and a soft, dependent and subservient gender. But during the medieval era, there is a slow process to not only align gender with biological sex, but to also curtail the rights of previously independent women like abbesses, nuns and unmarried women, as well as controlling their sexual behavior. So the seductive image of the Queen of Faery, who is characterized as dangerous and evil, also goes a long way to demonizing human females who had agency and tried to be independent in their lives and, sex lives. Let's go on to the Celtic cultural context. Here, those we now understand as the fairies weren't called elves, they were called the Esshi, or the Tua de Danann, both the original inhabitants of Ireland as well as the old gods of this territory. In this cultural context, the fairies are usually connected to landscape features such as a hill, a marker, tree, hawthorn or apple, or a particular lake or wood, and they were protective spirits of these areas. Basically, if you went in there, you were looking for trouble. The fairies of this tradition are dangerous. They inhabit an other world that has connections with the human world at specific places and times. For example, a specific wood, a specific lake, or, which is very interesting, a burial mound. And the times that you were most likely to encounter fairies were ambiguous, such as dawn, noon, and dusk, and Fridays apparently, for some reason. Good luck. In Celtic folklore, fairies weren't friendly at all. They were often dangerous to humans and could carry them off into their world, never to return, or leave them with an illness, such as a maimed arm, leg, a blind eye, or other problems that they didn't previously have. In exchange, sometimes the fairies would also leave the human with a gift. In the case of Thomas the Rhymer, abducted by the Queen of Faery in a Scottish ballad, there's a dog. Let's get back to Thomas the Rhymer. He was left with a tongue that cannot lie, so that afterwards he was thought of as a prophet. Not being able to lie also has its problems, so That's a very loud dog. Going into Elfland would be very dangerous, but it could also be empowering. However, most people did not want to have any special powers and didn't want to encounter fairies at all, so they used amulets like iron or a cross, and generally, just avoided those times and places. Other legends also point to ambiguous and liminal times, such as childbirth, as times when humans are particularly susceptible to the influence of fairies. In the Ballad of Sir Orfeo, the main character has to go rescue his wife from the fairy king, who has abducted her, and while he is in Elfland, he discovers a gallery of people who have also been taken by the fairies, among whom are many women in childbirth. In most of Celtic folklore, being either at an ambiguous time of your life, such as childbirth, or being part of a marginal group of society, such as a traveling bard or low-class merchant, also made you open to being abducted. What are the key common elements among all these folkloric traditions? First, there is a certain otherness that involves a close relationship, but also a separate existence, so they have a shared ambiguity that also affects how they relate to us and how we can encounter them, and also a natural link and a close connection to the landscape. These creatures of the folkloric otherworld are also all subsequently demonized as Christianization and particularly Protestantism advance. So how do we get from the ambiguous, dangerous and sometimes straight out demonic fairies of folkloric traditions to the dainty, cute and friendly fairies of today's aesthetics and paganisms? This is a process that begins in the 12th century with the literary Arthurian tradition, where a lot of fairies bobbing around, and has its highest point in the 19th century with Romanticism, the study of folklore, fairy tale collections for children, and scientific theories about the origin of fairies. So let's talk about Elizabethan England. When did it happen? It's the time where industrialization and capitalism really start to take root. By this point, fairies were already conceptualized as belonging to a pre-capitalist, agrarian, idealized past. But some of the fairies written in Elizabethan England behave like beautiful, excessive and consumeristic courtiers. For example, in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, the playwright places Titania and Oberon in a natural landscape and highlights their involvement with domestic matters, as was done in folklore, through the blessing of their marriage beds at the end of the play. However, there is a conflict in this play centered around the custody of a boy, which Titania and Oberon are fighting over. He is an Indian boy who is the son of one of Titania's devotees, and as such she refuses to sell him, so she refuses to engage in consumeristic and imperialistic trade practices. On the other side of the equation, Oberon, king of the fairies, represent this materialistic and imperialistic tendency. Let us continue with the process of time. In the 19th century, in Victorian England, the concern with a pre-industrial past becomes a real obsession. For example, the Romantic movement, despite their own time, and idealized the medieval period in the art. This is a key element for our view of fairies today, and you'll see why at the end of the video, so stick around. In this era, industrialization was taking such a rapid pace that people often felt that traditional ways of life were being forgotten and lost. This prompted scholars, such as folklorists, to try and collect stories, traditions and customs from the peasant layers of society. This is a high-class person that attended an elite school, going into the countryside and trying to collect stories from informants who were thought of as pure sources of who the people really were. At this stage, it is that we start to see collections of folk tales and the transformation of legends into fairy tales. In these stories, we often see fairies and other supernatural beings as helpers to the main human hero. And most importantly, we also see the displacement of these important narratives to an audience of children. This was due to the Victorian idea of social Darwinism, which basically meant that just as there is a biological evolution, they thought there was a natural cultural evolution going from primitive stages to the most evolved stages of society, which of course they thought they themselves represented, industrial, modern, scientific society. and they obviously felt superior to those in the lower stages, they also thought this development of society was reflected in the development of the human individual. So, something that was apparently appealing to societies at a lower rung in this cultural evolution would logically, according to this theory, also be appealing to undeveloped individual humans, that is, children. So we start to see the element of danger in fairies and elves being tamed to fit narratives that were viable for telling your children before sleep. I mean, I guess abductions and seductions don't really fit the mold there. The Victorians also had some theories about the origin of the fairies, and these involve first, a very old theory, the idea that fairies were either neutral angels that in the dispute between God and the devil weren't good enough to be in heaven, nor evil enough to be in hell, so they just stuck around Earth and caused trouble, and that's why they were thought to be so beautiful. And the extreme version of this theory was that fairies were demons. Another theory was that fairies and elves were representations of the ancestors that, having passed away from human society, now dwelled, for example, in burial mounds. The third theory that really took flight in Victorian times was that of the hidden people. It's a racialized theory that posited that there was a pre-human species of beings that inhabited the whole of Europe throughout prehistory, were very small, and were driven into hiding by the arrival of modern humans. Another influential theory was that of the elementals, which thought that there were creatures that represented or lived in or ruled the four elements, and fairies, in this theory, belonged to the air category. And in the 19th century, theosophists and spiritualists tried to develop this idea into the biological physical theory. They basically thought that fairies were beings tied to vegetation, and they were responsible for natural processes such as photosynthesis. The idea that fairies are small, as we sometimes think about them today, Tinkerbell for example, is a rationalization. It was at this time that illustrations of the flower fairies by Cicely Mary Barker became popular. These depict tiny beings in the shape of children with dainty ethereal wings and linked to flowers and plants and gardens, and they're really just very cute. But all these attempts at explaining the origin of fairies, attempt to give fairies a scientific base, are a form of disenchantment. That is essentially a tendency stemming from the Enlightenment, according to Max Weber, to reduce the world's mystery to easily explainable and understandable terms. But does it all end here, with disenchantment? I think not. Tolkien rejects the idea that fairies and fairy tales exist specifically for children. In his own work, Tolkien recovers many of the elements of the elves of folktales. All elves are characterized as particularly beautiful, separate in their existence from humans and concerned mostly with themselves, a certain danger. They are also always linked to a pre-capitalist worldview that is always conceptualized as good. The connection to specific places, for example, the elves of Lothlorien, are sort of bound to their land, can't really leave it unless they leave it forever. He also thought that fairy tales were not particularly concerned with fairies and elves as beings in themselves, but rather with a sense of enchantment. So by going into elfland or fairyland, a human becomes part of that very realm, and in the process becomes enchanted themselves. The key element in all of these stories is the protagonist's desire for something beyond the world that they usually inhabit. So we will get back to this in a little bit. And what about today? Are there more reasons why we're so fascinated? Both in the aesthetic and the religious pagan realms, we find that the element of danger is disregarded or lost today. A lot of what we think and believe about fairies has been shaped by the Victorian era rather than by the older pre-industrial and dangerous fairy lore. There is an element of personal connection. Fairies are often treated as fairies are in folktales shaped by Victorian belief, as a sort of side piece to the central character, which is usually human. instead of a complete other concerned with its own existence. Like in Cinderella, the fairy godmother helps her go to the ball by providing her with a dress and a huge pumpkin carriage. I wouldn't mind a pumpkin carriage to take me places. Fairies are reduced to a human perspective. We also see the Victorian theory that fairies were intrinsically connected to natural features in a lot of paganism's environmental discourse. In Iceland, if a road is being built through a natural landscape, there might be a fairy sighting indicating that the fairies are displeased with this development, and sometimes the authorities will reroute the road. Elves and fairies are felt to be guardians of a place. They enable us to have a personal relationship with nature that we feel was lost with industrialization and the division that it introduced between people and the land that sustains them. In fairycore and elfcore and all these aesthetic movements, there is a sense of longing carried over from Romanticism. We have this impulse towards a happier past, untouched by the corrupting forces of capitalism and industry. These aesthetics developed during the pandemic, a time when a lot of us came face to face with the hard realities of the system that we live in. So it makes sense that this would make us long for an idealized version of the past. I must also add, there is an element of queerness carried over all the way from the Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon folklore. The ambiguity of fairies and elves in general provides marginalized groups like queer people and disabled people with a space to express themselves more freely. Tolkien equated the element of fantasy to a deep desire in the human heart. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han has claimed that love requires the courage to accept self-negation for the sake of discovering the other. Our contemporary society, centered on self-reference, narcissism, and transparence, is particularly inimical to this. Haven't you felt the desire to post everything that you do to your social media? I know, I have. And this desire to make ourselves visible, to understand other people not as a whole person but as the surface that we see of them, eliminates the possibility of a radically different other necessary for a relationship of desire and love. Han has also argued that this loss of the non-self also kills critical thinking, which we suppose we understand everything. In the Scottish witch hunts, meetings with fairies reflect the pleasures in life that the Scottish peasantry were being deprived of through government legislation. If Elfland and the fairies have the same mirroring and supplementary function today as they did then, what is it that we are missing? I believe it's about a personal connection to nature, a discontent with our economical system and an attempt to put ourselves outside of it, and most importantly, the desire for something completely other to our experience that can't really be explained through our methods of knowledge and gives us a certain sense of meaning beyond ourselves. But even if it was just about escape, I really don't think that's a bad thing. Why should a man be scorned if finding himself in prison he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. Why did I do that voice? I don't know. The only people who oppose escapism are really jailers. So, if it is your heart's desire, wear your pointy ears, wear your fairy wings, and escape into whatever fantasy land suits your fancy. And maybe, just drop something in the comments if you enjoyed this video. For more videos on legends, mythology, and folklore, do tap on the subscribe button and ring the bell. See you next time! Medievalization. Bim 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 bim. That's a dirty hand. Please go away. Oh, I forgot my elf ears. It is hot here. Se pueden callar.